Next, to help make sense of the threat landscape and how NSA operationalizes insights through collaborative partnerships, Bailey Bickley, the Chief of DIB Defense at the National Security Agency's Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, will join us for an interview session. Bailey is responsible for key initiatives to evolve the CCC and deliver intel-driven cybersecurity solutions across the DIB, and has revitalized the way the NSA engages with the cybersecurity community at the unclassified level. She's worked across 2 intelligence community agencies as well as in the private sector. Thank you for joining us today, Bailey.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. And Bailey, we're very grateful for you giving your time today. I think that this is an audience, as you know, the defense industrial base, that's very interested in kind of your role and all the things that the NSA is doing relative to the defense industrial base. And related to that, you were named Chief of Defense Industrial Base, previously Chief Strategy Officer at the NSA's Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. What changes for you with the new title, and does this mean that NCC is playing a greater emphasis on the DIB, is placing a greater emphasis?
Yeah, first, Eric, thank you so much for the warm introduction. Thanks for having me here. So by quick way of background, I've worked in the NSA Cybersecurity Collaboration Center for about 2 years now. Spent the first a year and a half, really focused on strategy for the center. So looking across each of our mission sets and making sure we were communicating them to our stakeholders effectively, gaining more resources, et cetera. And so I was recently named chief of one of our organizations here, DIB Defense. So the biggest thing that's changed for me is I've been able to get a lot closer to working with the mission and the people. I have absolutely the best team in the world. Shout out if they're listening. But so my org specifically, we provide no-cost cybersecurity services to members of the defense industrial base. So really anyone that contracts with DoD, sub, or prime. But taking a step back, the CCC is putting a significant emphasis on the defense industrial base, and here's why. So in about 2020, we were delegated authorities from DoD for us to engage directly with the defense industrial base. And the reason why is because NSA has very unique insights on nation state cyber threats. We understand their plans, intentions, capabilities due to our global our signals intelligence mission. But we really rightly lack insights in a domestic space in terms of how they're targeting the networks we care the most about. Once they're on those networks, what are they doing to move laterally within them? And those insights really rest in the private sector. And specifically within the DIB, we know that sector is relentlessly targeted by our adversaries. And so it just made sense to have a center where 2 things could happen. First, government and industry was coming together to share our insights and put the pieces together of the puzzle. And second, that we were really working with industry to operationalize our insights, to get them down to the unclassified level and into the hands of folks that can action them across not only the defense industrial base, but all critical infrastructure sectors as well.
Well, that's so encouraging. I mean, I have felt for a long time the public-private partnership between really the federal government and then industry, in this case, the defense industrial base and the other critical infrastructure sectors, is just so strong. And to hear the collaboration between an intelligence community partner, a DoD partner, and industry, and how it's coming together to provide operational capabilities is super encouraging. I think it's a story that's not told enough. You mentioned kind of some of the things in the CCC that are done to help enable and operationalize the DIB, who, as you stated, is under constant assault from hostile adversaries. And so I'd love to understand, how does the NSA better enable the DIB to kind of detect, defend, and report cyber threats?
Yeah, so we're working with 475 partners right now at every level of the DIB ecosystem. And what I mean by that is, we work with DIB primes that cover 80% of DoD acquisition spending. We work with ISPs, internet service providers, antivirus providers that reach billions of endpoints across the globe. But we also work with small to medium-sized companies, those mom and pop companies that are really small, resource constrained, but are still really critical members of the DoD supply chain. So that's what we refer to when we talk about the DIB ecosystem. And we really have three major lines of effort. The first one is sharing our unique insights with high impact partners. So working with the biggest and best IT and cybersecurity companies to, again, take what NSA knows from our unique sources, so to speak, sanitize that, get it down to the unclassified level so that it can be actioned, so that our partners can build signatures, detection, mitigation techniques, and scale those. In return, we're getting insights from them that are really helping to better augment our understanding of the threat landscape and helping us build a more comprehensive picture of nation-state threats. The second thing that we're doing is we're providing no-cost cybersecurity to small to medium-sized businesses. And our set of services has really been engineered to defend against the top ways that we see nation-state actors successfully targeting the DIB. They're available for free, and we'll do a deep dive into those later. And then the final thing that we're really focused on here is securing emerging technology through standards. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that space, standards are how you write both security and interoperability requirements into emerging technology during the development process. So we're looking at things like cloud, updating secure protocols for post-quantum cryptography, 5G, and we're making sure that the US national security perspective is injected into standards as they're being developed.
It's incredible. I know what a breadth of kind of addressing the whole ecosystem, kind of from the large primes whose kind of names we all know to the kind of smaller, 10-person machine shop in Iowa. It's amazing the ground that you have to cover. And I think the way you articulated it, Bailey, really speaks to the fact that I think what our audience here, most of them are here because of CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Compliance. It's perceived as very difficult for some of the reasons that you mentioned around kind of the breadth and the ecosystem that has to be secured. And we've done research that says about 70% of the DIB rates it as a 7 or higher on the scale of 1 to 10 relative to the complexity and the difficulty with achieving compliance. Relative to kind of your capabilities and the work that you're doing, what can or is the CCC doing to lower the challenge bar here?
Yeah. So first, I'll tell a little bit of a personal story. I sit next to a guy that works for the center now, but he used to be a CISO for a small business that contracted with DoD. So he was very familiar with CMMC and NIST 800, 171, and 172. And he helped educate me, but I spent a whole weekend reading through CMMC documentation and NIST 800, 171, 172. I came back to work and I was like, holy crap, Mike, you weren't lying. Like, it's hard, and cyber is hard. So I wanted to address that first. We understand that it is a challenge. So what we're doing specifically is a couple things. First, we're working with DoD CIO and DC3 to map our services back to NIST 800, 171. And we always clarify that our services are not a one-stop shop for CMMC compliance, which you all know, nothing is that easy. But they do support several NIST 800, 171 controls, and I'll rattle them off at the end so folks know. But we're working with DoD to better clarify that. We're also working with DC3 to jointly market our services. So NSA CCC offers 3 services now. We're piloting 4 more. DC3 has their core set of offerings. We're working to jointly develop slick sheets and marketing materials so that folks know if you enroll in all of these services, here's the different parts of NIST 800, 171 or CMMC compliance that you'll be covering. So for us, our protective DNS service supports 3.14.06 from 171. We offer attack surface management, which supports risk assessment controls 3.11, 02, and 03. And then we offer threat intelligence collaboration, which supports system and information integrity controls 3.14.03. I'll get better at rattling those off one day. But we're really trying to offer these things at no cost to DIB companies. They are free because DoD has fronted the cost, because we know that this is hard and we know it's expensive. So this is something that we can do to help.
That's amazing. I mean, there's a couple things in what you said that I think, again, for me, it sprouts a lot of optimism, right? Just to hear the collaboration with the DC3, we actually had Steve Shirley speaking today, who is a former executive director of Defense Cybercrime Center. So just the connective tissue to hear that that's in place and deepening between NSA and DC3 and DoD and industry, and there really is a whole of government approach, I think is super encouraging. And the idea to find a way to do things free, and then to do the mapping for industry to show them here's how it ties back to compliance, I think is super helpful as well. And ultimately, the why behind CMMC and a lot of these efforts, obviously, is to address actual threats. It's not kind of just a compliance exercise. And so I imagine in your space, you spend a lot of time thinking about and dealing with and responding to nation state threats. Get a lot of press, obviously, deservedly so. But I think one of the things that would be great is, for the defense contractors in our audience struggling to quantify really how pervasive and real these threats are. I'd love to hear from someone with your experience and background. How would you characterize these nation state threats?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've been in this job a couple months now, and my first talk, I led with nation state threats, and I could see people's eyes glaze over. And then I started talking about CMMC compliance and winning government contracts, and people were on the edge of their seats. And so I think, I took a lot of things away from that, but I think the most important thing we need people to understand is that they are a target. And I know that small businesses don't really believe that because they're just producing one small component or one small widget of an overall weapon system. But our adversaries are really looking for those weak links. They do broad scanning. The People's Republic of China especially takes a really broad approach, and they're going after the weakest link in DoD supply chains. And I think, one of our biggest messages to folks is just don't be that weak link. And you can kind of draw the parallels between cybersecurity and physical security. If somebody is walking down a street, trying all the car doors, you want to make sure your doors are locked. So, when we think about nation state threats, we think about the PRC first, of course, because they really put the persistent in APT. They are just persistent and pervasive. And if you find them in your networks and kick them out, they will be back. They're not really worried about getting caught. And, they certainly do a lot of intellectual property theft. And we have to tell people and educate people, the PRC loves you. They are hacking into your network. They are copy pasting your proprietary information, and they're using that to undermine not only our national security, but also our economy as well. So there's very significant implications to that. I won't say too much on this, but there's been a lot of recent press reporting about the PRC using living off the land techniques, which is hard to detect. It makes them blend in with legitimate traffic, and doing some really scary things across critical infrastructure. So it really is a real threat. Of course, Russia, DPRK, Iran are just as disruptive as well. And every day we're seeing targeting, we're seeing exploitation attempts, we're seeing exfiltration. And that's what we're trying to get in front of. But, another thing that I tell DIB companies is it's not just the nation state threats that they have to worry about. It's also ransomware. Which, as you all know, really disproportionately impacts small businesses. And then there's the human element of how do you manage your resources? How do you protect against patch fatigue? I saw a statistic that said last year, more than 20,000 vulnerabilities were published in the National Vulnerability Database, but only 2% were actually exploited. So, if you're a CISO, if you're a CEO, if you're the IT guy in a small, 30-person company, you do have to worry about the nation state threats. You have to worry about the malicious cyber activity, and you just have to worry about architecting and defending your networks. And we do think that we have a core set of services that can help with each one of those things.
I think you made a really key point at the beginning there, Bailey. I mean, the idea that, and it can be a little bit kind of overwhelming in terms of just hearing about nation state threats all the time, where it can be a little bit eyes glazed over. But the idea that compliance is very interesting to an audience because it's what stands in the way of potential revenue. I think actually, a lot of credit goes to the federal government and really the DoD and the intelligence community partners and industry in creating a regulation like this, because I think ultimately compliance is the only way to kind of change behavior and make it a prerequisite to winning federal contracts. And then over some period of time, we'll probably have those baseline cybersecurity controls to address, hopefully, if not address, better report and share intelligence related to these nation state threats. So I think that that also aligns with my experience, and that people are very interested in compliance. So you covered a lot on the nation state threats and the pervasiveness of it, and kind of the how real it is. Tell us some good news. Tell us about the places where NSA and other government agencies are collaborating, sharing information, and making a difference as it relates to cybersecurity.
Yeah. I think the first thing in terms of a scene setter is the recently released National Cybersecurity Strategy. One of the themes that I love from that is talking about shifting the balance and the burden of responsibility away from the small businesses, away from the individual consumers, and onto those entities, whether government or industry, that are best able to bear the brunt of that, right? And so I think that in general, government is asking more of industry, but it's also giving more. And so I'll give a couple examples, of just activity happening here in the center. So, when I talk about bidirectional threat information sharing with these major companies, we're sanitizing unique insights and giving it to folks. We've had 10,000 bidirectional exchanges with companies since our inception, on nation state malware, on nation state techniques, tactics, procedures. And I'll tell a cool story. So we had a company come to us and say, a DIB company, and say, hey, we're seeing this activity on our network. We don't know what it is, but we know it's not good. Can you help us dig into this? And so we started to pull the thread on that, and we realized that their network was calling out to a nation state obfuscation network. And that is not good. And so we were able to actually look across everyone that was enrolled in our attack surface management program to say, okay, we know that a nation state actor is calling out to this one network, and they're doing so from a certain environment, a certain technology. What other customers are using that Citrix technology? So that we can see if they're having malicious activity on their networks as well. So we looked across, everyone who we'd done vulnerability scanning across, and we were able to find about 10 customers that were running this certain Citrix environment. We created hunt guidance that said, hey, we know that there's a vulnerability within the system that our adversaries are aware of. Here's some hunting guidance. Take this, go see if you can find the adversary on your network. And within hours of releasing that guidance, the phone was ringing nonstop. And all of these people were coming in and saying, yeah, we found this activity, we're compromised as well. So we knew at that point, we had not discovered a one-off, we had discovered a broad nation state campaign that was targeting the DIB. So we were ultimately able to work with all of those customers and work with Citrix to find the initial exploitation vector, which was a 0-day vulnerability. We were able to get a patch release, do an advisory that alerted the whole community to the patch and the exploitation activity. And within a couple days of that, we saw an independent cybersecurity firm publish research that said, as a result of that advisory and the attribution to the specific APT and the coordinated way that was done, the number of vulnerable servers across the US and Five Eyes allies decreased significantly. And so that's just one example of how when we all come together in a way that is collaborative, but also trust-based, we work very carefully to not publicly publicize anybody's compromise or anything like that, but we can have a real impact against these sophisticated threats.
It's an amazing story. And I think what it screams to me is engagement, right? Engage with the resources that are out, be it DC3, NSA, CCC, whether it's, your particular DCSA rep, there's resources available to you. And the stories that can happen when you engage are incredible. We can, I think, actually figure this out from a cybersecurity perspective. So many of the headlines are always doom and gloom, but when you hear a story like that, it tells you how that public-private partnership can be so impactful and so actionable. It's an amazing story. Our research shows that about 81% of defense industrial-based contractors claim to be compliant with the contractually mandated requirements of NIST 800-171, about 110 controls based on their self-assessment. I'd love to hear your experience with industry, DIB contractors. Are you finding high levels of compliance and investment in cybersecurity? What's that look like for you?
Yeah, so I know this is a conference about CMMC, but it's a good time to clarify that for NSA, for RCCC, something that's really beautiful is we don't play in the compliance space. We know that that's something that motivates and incentivizes DoD contractors, but for us, there is nothing that contractually or congressionally requires anyone to work with us. All of our relationships are voluntary and based off of mutual benefit. And our relationships are also underpinned by non-disclosure agreements that protect the privacy of what's being shared. So generally, because we're in that space, we don't have any insights into compliance. But we do encourage our contractors, obviously they are, or I should say our partners, obviously they have to be compliant with their contract requirements. They have to adhere to reporting requirements. But that just goes to another part of DoD. It's not us. That said, I think in general across the community, we all see extremely high levels of investment in cybersecurity. I started in cyber at NSA in 2014. I worked in something called the Information Assurance Directorate, which was the precursor to our Cybersecurity Directorate. And I was working there when 3 kind of high-profile hacks happened: Sony, the Executive Office of the President hack, and OPM. And I remember closely following those at the time because of where I worked. But, I think in the broader community, I don't know that there was significant change around that. And when you compare and contrast that with what happened with SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline, there's been so much investment from the federal government and the private sector to say, here's what we're going to do to make sure these types of things don't happen again. There's been executive orders and commitments from large private sector firms. And, even down to the small businesses, I think something that really stands out to me is the sense of community. I'm a people person, and in cyber, there's just a phenomenal community of people that want to help each other. They want to help each other with compliance, with understanding these things, with just every bit and piece that comes with this. And so, that was a long-winded way of saying no insights into compliance, but do see that strong level of investment from the cybersecurity community.
No, but that's great. I think one of the things that you highlighted, and I guess maybe I always think it's understood, but I think it's worth mentioning, is the whole confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements and the kind of integrity of the relationship. In my experience, having been a CISO at a global aerospace and defense company and kind of collaborated and reported things to the government, there really is a tremendous sense of protecting of that confidentiality in the relationship. And I think it's a very important point. If people don't understand it, they're really, I think we've evolved, I hope, from the I think in the early days, it was very much like a reluctance around the big primes to share some information with the government, be it NSA, DC3, DoD, whomever, because there was a fear it would be used against them in procurement. I think that ship has sailed. I think everyone understands this as a partnership now. So I think that's a great point, Bailey. If you were on the other side of government cybersecurity requirements, not even just from an operational perspective, there's so many great resources. You've mentioned a lot of them today. If you, as a prime or subcontractor, where would you start and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for setting me up for this. So the first place I would start is with the free services that DoD is already offering, both from NSA, CCC, and DC3. I'm sure you all, this community especially, is tracking, the recent movements with CMMC and that it was sent to OMB, et cetera. So as you're starting to think through and prepare for that, start with what is already offered today at no cost to you. I'll highlight our services. So we offer 3: protective DNS, attack surface management, and threat intel collaboration. So for protective DNS, I'm sure you all are familiar with the domain name system. It's the address book of the internet. And because it's so pervasive to the internet, we frequently see it being used by our adversaries to gain initial access to their targets, install malware, and even do data exfil. And so our protective DNS service is offered through a contracted provider, Akamai, and we use 2 things in that. We use Akamai's commercial threat intelligence feeds to block users from connecting to known malicious or suspicious sites, but we're also feeding in NSA unique non-public indicators of known bad activity. And we're getting those from, our global signals intelligence enterprise. We're getting them passed to us from our partners, and we're getting them from NSA analytics. And so what that is doing is it's making sure that DIB customers that are enrolled are protected against emerging threat activity. We update the block list every week with these indicators. And to date, we've blocked 10 billion instances of malicious activity, and that includes ransomware activity, nation-state malware, DNS tunneling, botnets, etc. So that's been a really good service. The second one is attack surface management, and this is really twofold. So the first part of this is helping small businesses identify what parts of their network are touching the internet. And we use open source or commercially available tools to do that. But the whole premise with that is if we can see it, our adversaries can see it, and they likely have seen it and have found it, right? So helping customers understand that. And then the second piece of that is doing vulnerability scanning across what we found to determine where folks might be vulnerable. And, I don't know if you all have ever received a vulnerability scan report, but it is comprehensive, maybe 80 pages, and it can be really challenging to know where to start with that information. How do I action that? So our service comes in and we actually provide a tailored report for each of our customers that says, hey, based off of what we know adversaries are targeting, here's the top 3 to 5, maybe 10 issues that you really want to drill down into and take care of today. The final feature of that program, which I absolutely love, is that we monitor open source. Earlier, I talked about 20,000 vulnerabilities, but only 2% of them are ever exploited, right? So we actually monitor open source, and when we see mass exploitation of a vulnerability starting or a proof of concept for an exploit, et cetera, we'll go search our holdings every single day and find out which DIB customers are vulnerable to that new exploit. And within hours, we send them a notification and we say, hey, maybe 6 months ago, we told you that you had this unpatched vulnerability, but as of today, we're seeing exploitation by this actor, and we really need you to go fix it now. We have a 52% response rate to those notifications, which is significant. and definitive proof that because of those, our customers are finding and fixing issues prior to getting compromised. And that's something we get super excited about. So the final thing, a final plug, threat intelligence collaboration. This is our final mature service. Simply put, you can sign an NDA and receive non-public DIB-specific threat intelligence from NSA. And conversely, we welcome any insights that you want to share as well. So where would I start? I would start with these. You can go nsa.gov/ccc to start the enrollment process. And again, it's free. And so it's just to give you a little bit of a leg up in your whole cybersecurity journey.
That's amazing. Bailey, if you wouldn't mind, one more time, that website to get started?
Yes, it is www.nsa.gov/ccc. If you scroll halfway down the page, you'll see a form that says get started, and just click that and it'll walk you through a very simple process.
That's an amazing set of capabilities. Again, all kind of at no cost, and then mapped back to many of the compliance requirements that we're here to talk about today. But I think even more importantly, just to hear the operational kind of utility of these services is just incredible. And again, another good news story. I'm such an optimist in the cybersecurity space when I talk to folks like you, and I understand kind of this partnership and with public-private entities and how it's coming together. And I think that brings me to a question I wanted to ask you. The United States government really seems to be promoting meaningful and potentially impactful regulation to drive private sector investment in cybersecurity. And so I'm wondering, are we finally getting serious about cybersecurity? Or said another way, have you seen evidence that it's working? Are we actually kind of turning a corner relative to cybersecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think a resounding yes. At NSA, we've been doing cybersecurity since the early days. We just called it different things throughout the years. So we like to say we've been doing cyber since before it was cool. But we have absolutely rounded a corner in terms of the U.S. government's commitment and the private sector's commitment. From the stand-up of CISA to now what we've seen with the Office of the National Cyber Director and the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology. There's a lot of investments being made. In terms of evidence, I'll point to a couple of different things. Hopefully it's still satisfying because this is an unclassified forum, so I'm going to choose my words carefully. But in my previous role as strategist, I did a lot of KPIs, metrics tracking, and we have quantitative metrics that we track every quarter, and we actually report up to DoD, ODNI, et cetera. And, we're looking at things like what we're blocking through PDNS, vulnerabilities discovered, disclosed, and remediated, that type of thing. Our antivirus partners reach 2 billion endpoints. So when we push information on nation state TTPs and they update their, signatures to defend against that, global impact. Another example, on nsa.gov, we frequently release advisories. We released one a couple weeks ago on living off the land techniques being used by PRC actors. And if you go to the last page of that advisory, there's an acknowledgement section. And we acknowledged 14 industry partners that contributed to that advisory, as well as all of the Five Eyes nations, and a wealth of interagency colleagues and friends. And so that's one example of sophisticated, hard to detect activity, but the whole community is coming together to get after it. And the final thing I'll say on this is, I tell people we get feedback a lot. We get it from our partners. We get it from our DIB customers. And thanks to our global SIGINT system, we also get it from our adversaries. So we do know that we have evidence that, the changes and the investments that we're all making in cybersecurity are having an impact.
That's great. I think that's a wonderful appeal for everyone in the audience to be part of that solution and to continue to drive the ball forward. I think that's again very encouraging. Wonderful to hear. Bailey, you've been super generous with your time, so I'm going to ask you one last question here. And just to understand, we see a barrage of headlines about vulnerabilities and risks of cybersecurity solutions and relative to the supply chain. You touched on the ecosystem and of the supply chain a little bit earlier, but how should the defense industrial base be thinking about and vetting the technology they use as these supply chains just continue to expand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll say two things. So at NSA, we have to protect the defense industrial base, but we also have to protect national security systems. And those are defined as systems that handle classified information or are otherwise important to intelligence or warfighting. So that could be a classified network, it could be a drone, a weapon system, it could be a radio that the warfighter is holding in their hands. And I'm saying all this to go somewhere. Obviously, in those systems, it makes a lot more sense to use commercial components and commercial solutions in terms of time, cost savings, et cetera. But we have to make sure those are secure. So we have a program at NSA where we are essentially setting the security requirements for commercial components to be used in protecting these really sensitive systems. Then, if a vendor comes in and says, hey, we've built to the specs that you've provided, the second half of that program is actually evaluating the technology to make sure it is in fact built in a way that's secure. That program is called NIAP, which stands for the National Information Assurance Partnership. And they have a public-facing website where they publish NIAP certified technologies and components. So if a DIB small to medium sized company is looking for where do I start, how do I know what I'm investing in is secure, I would recommend that as a good place to start. Simply because we at NSA are using those components in a layered fashion to protect our most sensitive systems. So we can certainly vouch for those. The other thing I would say, and I know no small business wants to hear this, but you have to start thinking about post-quantum. Our director, Rob Joyce, just did a really, really good podcast on this and how it's going to impact everybody, when a quantum computer is eventually created. And so for the federal government right now, we are looking across all of our systems to update the cryptography in them. And we're publishing guidance on nsa.gov to help the broader community with their transition as well. CISA is also playing in that space. So I think in the near term, use those solutions that are already vetted. And in the long term, you just have to start thinking through those business risks and what you're doing now to inventory and invest and prepare for them.
Another set of wonderful resources available to our audience here at no cost. And also, again, it wasn't necessarily the intent when we put this session together, but I think another wonderfully positive message around how the government is working, different parts of the government working together to make sure at the end of the day, as you referenced, the warfighter has secure technology and that all the supply chain and vendors behind it have been kind of screened and validated and to be doing the right thing in advance. And that's amazing. And it's I think, Bailey, I can't thank you, your colleagues, your partners, and the ecosystem that you're a part of enough. I think that you're doing wonderful work. We greatly appreciate your time today. And I think this was a amazing session for our audience today. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Cybersheath, and all of the event organizers and attendees. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bailey, for bringing your extensive knowledge, providing key insights and available resources to DIB companies as they adapt to CMMC 2.0.